When the Buddha started teaching, he started right in with the topic of suffering. He explained the middle way. The middle way was noble eightfold path. First factor of the path is right view, and the first truth in right view is the truth of suffering. And as he went on to say in another place, his teaching basically is about suffering and the end of suffering. And aside from that issue, he said he didn't want to talk about anything that would get in the way. When he defined suffering, he didn't say life is suffering. That would have been hopeless. And he didn't say simply that there is something. He said something a lot more specific, which is suffering is the 5 clinging aggregates. The aggregates are form, which is a physical form, feeling tones of pleasure, pain, neither pleasure nor pain. Perceptions, which are your labels you place on things. You see something red and you say red. You see this mug, you say mug, that's a perception. Fabrications, which are constructs that the mind puts together intentionally. And then finally, the act of consciousness itself. And as he said, it's because we cling to these things that we suffer. Most discussions of the Buddhist definitions of suffering focus on the aggregates. But as he says in many places, the real problem is clinging. There was actually a PhD thesis that was written several years ago, was printed as a book, in which the author said, the Buddha said, suffering is the 5 aggregates. And the author totally forgot about clinging. But clinging is the real problem. So what this means is that when the Buddha said he teaches suffering and the end of suffering, what he's really teaching is clinging and the end of clinging. And with the end of clinging, then true happiness is found. So today I'd like to talk about the topic of clinging, because once you understand this, it helps you understand a lot of other things within the Buddhist teachings and within the Buddhist practice, the practice of those teachings. This morning we'll be talking about clinging itself and the various forms it takes. And then this afternoon's discussion will be on the end of clinging. The Pali word for clinging, upadana, is sometimes defined as desire and passion, and sometimes it's also used to describe feeding, the act of taking sustenance, and the sustenance in which we take. And of course, sustenance here is not only physical sustenance, like physical food, but also food for the mind. And so what the Buddha is basically saying here is that we suffer because of our feeding habits. And we're going to have to learn how to change our feeding habits and eventually get to the point where the mind no longer needs to feed. That will be the true end of suffering. But along the way, we learn how to feed in more skillful ways, which means that even though the path to the end of clinging would put an end to clinging, it will involve some pain in the course of the path itself. And we'll get into why that is. This is one of the reasons why the first noble truth is noble. The suffering itself is not a noble thing, but the fact that we realize that the way we feed is the problem, and we're going to have to change the way we feed. And on top of that, there's a noble duty. We have to comprehend it. Suffering is something we tend to either run away from, or we decide that there's no alternatives, we're just going to hold on tighter. That's not a particularly noble activity. But the Buddha says if you want, the proper thing to do with suffering is to try to comprehend it, which means understanding it to the point of putting an end to passion, aversion, and delusion toward it. Clinging comes in 4 types. The technical terms are sensuality clinging, view clinging, habit and practice clinging, and then doctrine of self clinging. Sensuality here is not so much sensual pleasures, but it's the mind's fascination with thinking about and planning for sensual pleasures. For example, you want a pizza. The problem is not the pizza so much as the fact that your mind can think about all those different toppings you could choose. You could decide, well, what kind of toppings do I want? Do I want this? Do I want that? And then you get focused on planning, and actually you feed more off of the plans than you do off of the pizza itself. And that's the problem. The mind gets so dependent on planning its sensual pleasures, looking for happiness in its plans for sensual pleasures, that it wastes a lot of its energy that could be put to much better use. The Buddhist comment that you're more attached to the thinking than you are to the actual object. You can give yourself a test. Suppose, for example, you're planning a pizza and you order the pizza and it turns out that the pizza place is out of that particular kind of topping. So that's too bad, but then you can think up another topping and order that. However, if someone were to tell you, okay, you are not allowed to think about pizza for the next hour, the mind would rebel. we really are attached to our fascination with fabricating thoughts around the central pleasures. That's that's the first kind of clinging. The second is view clinging, which basically has to do with your views about the world. What is reality out there, how it works. Habit and practice clinging is basically your ideas about how you should act within the world in order to find the pleasure you want. A classic story, those of you who've heard me talk about clinging before will probably have heard this story, but those of you who haven't, I'd like to tell you the story about Konrad Lorenz and his goose. Konrad Lorenz was a biologist who lived in Austria. He raised a goose when the goose had goslings. The mother goose died, and there was one gosling left. And so the gosling immediately fixated on Konrad Lorenz. And throughout the summer, wherever Konrad Lorenz would go around in the garden, the gosling would follow him around. As the fall came and it started getting colder, Konrad Lorenz realized he was going to have to bring the gosling, which was now a well-sized goose, into the house. And so one evening, instead of feeding it at its normal time, he simply walked into the house and left the door open. Well, the goose followed him in. And then it was the first time it had ever been in an enclosed space and began to freak out. The house was arranged so that there was a hall leading from the door to the back wall of the house, with a window at the back wall. Then halfway down the hall, there was a stairway that went up to the right, which is run up to Konrad Lorenz's apartment. And so Konrad Lorenz walks in, goes up the stairway, but the goose thinks its main thought at that point is, I got to get out of here. It sees the open window, or what it thinks is an open window, and goes running toward it, realizes that it's closed. Meanwhile, Konrad Lorenz calls to the goose, so it turns around and goes back up the stairway. And then from that point on, every time the goose went into the house, it would first go to the window, back up, go up the stairs. And then over time, the trip to the window got shorter and shorter until eventually he would go to that side of the stairway, shake his foot at the window, and then head up the stairs. And then there was one night when Konrad Lorenz came back from work really late. And so the goose was really hungry. So as soon as Konrad Lorenz opened the door, the goose went running into the house and up the stairs. Got halfway up the stairs and stopped. Started shaking all over. And then very methodically walked down the stairway over to the window, then back up the stairs. So that's clinging to habits and practices. You're listening to your inner goose. And then finally, the fourth type of clinging is clinging to doctrines of self, is your sense of who you are, both as an agent and as a consumer. The agent, in other words, the person who can act within the world to find the pleasures that you want. And then there's a consumer, is the person, the you, who is going to enjoy the attainment of those pleasures. And if you look at your sense of self, that's basically the two functions it has. It's agent and consumer. And the Buddha is going to be focusing on both as problematic. So here we have four types of clinging. And in each case, you're clinging to a particular central habit of fantasizing about sensuality. View clinging, when you cling to views about the world, how it works, what is real in the world. 3, clinging to habits and practices, which are basically your ideas of what should be done, how you should act in order to gain the things that you want to gain. And then you as the agent consumer, in other words, you who will be acting within that world to find those pleasures. And you can see that these 4 types of clinging are very interrelated. This is going to be important. The first 3 act as the arena in which your self acts. You have a sense of who you are, what you would like, and then you look around the world and see what kind of pleasures the world has to offer and how the world works so that you can act within the world in order to gain those pleasures. So here we are, the Buddha is talking about and saying that these are basically our strategies for finding happiness, and yet he says they're suffering. And they're suffering for several reasons. One is that we use them as a foundation for deciding what to do. And so we hope to have at least establish some sort of solidity for at least a little while in terms of what kind of world we're operating in, how it operates, what we have to do in order to pull the levers properly, and then how we're going to benefit from this. But however, we're creating these ideas out of things that are very ephemeral. The aggregates arise and they pass away. And so we're holding on to things that are precarious. And it's that fact of being precarious, that's one of the aspects of clinging that leads to suffering. The other, as I said, is as the Buddha said, clinging is basically a type of feeding. And when you're in a position of having to feed, we like to feed, but you think about what it means. It means that your existence depends on something that is somewhat outside of your control. And it requires a constant act of feeding. There's never a point where you feed until you get enough. So it's in incessant, where is the next source of food? Where is the next source of food? Where is the next source of food? So this is why these types of clinging are suffering. Now the Buddha is going to be saying, as we find this afternoon, that you're going to have to take on certain skillful types of clinging in order to follow the path. That'll be one of the main lessons that we learn in the course of the day, is that you don't just drop your clinging. You first have to learn how to engage in skillful clinging before you get to the point where you no longer need to feed. But a few more things about why these things are suffering. First, with sensuality, of course, the pleasures are inconstant. And they often involve conflict. When the Buddha is talking about the drawbacks of sensuality, many of the discussions have to do with the fact that once you gain something, someone else will want it. And they'll try to take it from you. And so you have to defend it. This is why there's fights within the family, fights between families, fights within countries, fights between countries. It's because of our attachment to sensuality. In terms of views, sometimes this is defined as holding on to fixed views. In other words, you have a view that you hold on to no matter what. But actually, the Buddha includes agnosticism as a type of view that you could cling to and also suffer over. You also suffer from doubt when you realize that you don't really know, say, how the world is or how it functions. There's a lot of suffering there too. So in that case, you're hanging on to the view of doubt. So it's not just people who are certain about the truth of their views, but it's also any kind of view about the world is going to have an element of instability in it. And the fact that you're trying to feed off of something that is created out of ephemeral raw materials is going to involve suffering. The reason why you have to have views like this is where you have to calculate. When you're going to act, it's going to involve effort. And you have to ask yourself, is the effort worth it? And so you're going to have to look at, is the world designed in such a way that the effort I would put in, say, to long years of meditation, would that be worth it? Is the effort that I put into having a career, would that be worth it? We have to have some idea about the world in order to make that calculation as to what kind of efforts are really worthwhile. Talking about habits and practices, sometimes this particular type of clinging is translated as clinging to rites and rituals. And a lot of people say, especially in the modern world, so I don't have any rites or rituals in my life. But it's not just that. It's any habitual way of acting that you see at that particular point of time is something you should do. That's the word sila there, which is sometimes translated as precepts. It also means habit. What are your habits? The habits, like the habit of the goose and running to the window. But you will also have skillful habits. They will involve some suffering, but you engage in the skillful habits because if they really are skillful, they would lead you to something that's better. There will be some suffering involved in clinging there, but it's for a good purpose. And for the most part, there are a lot of people who cling to habits and practices that are really unskillful and will lead to all kinds of problems down the line. As for doctrines of self, these involve defining what you think you are, what your self is, and then it also involves the question of, does this self exist? Even the idea that there is no self at all, the Buddha says, is a type of self-clinging. It's a kind of doctrine of self that can make you suffer. And the term self here does not necessarily mean a permanent self. It could be any sense of self that you might hold on to. You as the agent and you as the consumer. Whether you decide that self is permanent or decide it's temporary. Clinging to any of these ideas would be a form of suffering. And we do these things, as I said, for the sake of the pleasure that comes from it. But the problem is that we often limit ourselves. We focus on a lowly pleasure, which closes off the road to a higher pleasure. And also, as I said, we're in a precarious position because the raw materials of which we make up our clinging are constantly shifting on us. So we constantly have to shore up our position and look for new things to cling when we realize that things we're clinging to at the moment we can't hold on to any longer. So this is the mind in a position of having to cling. That's where the suffering is. And the Buddha is going to be teaching us how to put the mind in a position where it doesn't need to cling, where it doesn't need to. That's the possibility that he opens up to us. I mentioned earlier that the different types of clinging are interrelated. The first three, sensuality, views, and habits and practices, are the arena in which your self acts. And in any one point, one of these types of clinging may be predominant. You may decide there's a particular pleasure you want. However, you've been told that the pursuit of that particular pleasure is a bad thing. And you may decide, okay, I'm not going to believe in that particular view of what I should and shouldn't do anymore. I'll just put it aside. I'll find another view which allows me to pursue this particular pleasure. And in this case, this would be a case of the sensuality clinging being predominant, taking over and determining what your views about the world will be and what your views about what you should and shouldn't do would be. There are other areas in which you might decide that you believe in a materialistic worldview. That's the one that makes sense to you. It seems scientific. And that would have some bearing on your ideas of what you should and should not do, or what is open to you as a choice of what you should and should not do. For example, years back, there was a Buddhist scholar who was saying that he could understand that the Buddha, learned how to be equanimous on the night of his awakening, but the idea that he found something that was deathless, he thought was really beyond the Buddha. He didn't understand how that could be. And it turned out that it was basically saying that given that what a human being is, this is a view of reality, this is a view of you clinging. There are certain things that a human being can know and certain things a human being cannot know. In this case, it was saying that because we're conditioned beings, we cannot know the unconditioned. In that case, that's a particular view of the world that you take on. And that limits your sense of what you can do, what kind of happiness you can find. So this is that of these first three types of clinging, different ones can predominate. Kant is an example of one in which the third type of clinging predominates. He was insistent on the idea that our dignity as human beings comes from the fact that we have freedom of choice in how to act. And so we had to create a worldview in which freedom of choice was possible, even within the confines of what at that time was a deterministic worldview that was proposed by Newton. So when we look at these different types of clinging, it's a very useful way of analyzing our addictions. You're addicted to a particular sensual pleasure, and then your view of yourself, your view of what you should do in order to get that pleasure, and your view of the world in which you're functioning will be determined by that particular addiction. And so one of the ways of getting past the addiction is one to find an alternative pleasure. And then you're also going to have to change the person's views about him or herself, the person's views about what should and shouldn't be done, and views about how the world functions. So these are all interrelated. Sometimes, however, they're in conflict. You look at those first three types of clinging, and Freud had a lot to say about them. In other words, there's the pleasure principle that he said that would correspond to sensuality clinging. And also the id, what the id wants, as far as Freud was concerned. And then the views about the world would be the reality principle. And then finally, this idea of what should and shouldn't be done, that would be your superego. And then you have yourself, which is the ego, which is trying to negotiate all these things. And in the worldview in which he had, those first three types of clinging were all at odds. The shoulds were telling you one thing, your desires for sensuality were telling you something else. And your poor little ego was caught in between, trying to negotiate among them. Of these types of clinging, even though I said the first three are the arena in which the self acts, the most basic type of clinging is clinging to the self. It's because we have a strong sense of who we are and how we will benefit from our actions, that we are interested in views about the world to begin with. We're interested about what should and shouldn't be done. We're looking for happiness for ourselves. As the Buddha said, only when you uproot this particular kind of clinging will you be able to uproot the others. There will always be, as long as there's a strong sense of self, or clinging to a particular sense of self at any one particular time, it will then spread out into these other types of clinging. And this is the only one where the Buddha actually goes into detail about how the clinging relates to the five aggregates. He says we tend to define ourselves around each of the aggregates in any of the four ways. Take form as an example. You either identify that you are your body, or else the body belongs to you. You're something separate. You're something related to the body, but separate from it, which is the owner of the body. Either that, or you are in the body. There's a little you inside that goes looking at your eyes and listening at your ears. Or else the body is in you. You might think of yourself as being a cosmic self, and then the body is simply a physical function within that larger sense of self that you identify with. So you have, in other words, you identify with the aggregate, you identify yourself as the owner of the aggregate, you identify yourself as in the aggregate, or as the aggregate in you. And that can apply to any one of the 5 aggregates. So all in all, there are 20 different ways, the Buddha says, of identifying yourself. It's for this reason that many schools of Buddhism focus all their attention on this one. They say if you let go of your attachment to self, then you let go of everything else. Now, they're right on one count, which is that those 2 roles of the self explain why clinging is suffering. You're constantly having to provide for yourself. And as you consume things, and you use them up, and you need more. So it's this constant position of instability in which you find yourself. That's what makes all these forms of clinging into suffering. But because the self negotiates among the other forms of clinging, it's deeply embedded in them. Like your sense of yourself, you as the producer, is based on the sense of the different range of skills that you have. And the fact that those skills function well within the world that you've been inhabiting for a long time. Now you see this gets challenged when you go to a different country, where the society operates on different principles, and all of a sudden the skills that you had before are no longer useful. Or society itself undergoes a big change. We've seen a lot of this with the pandemic. People who were able to function very well in the pre-pandemic world suddenly find that it's very difficult to function in the pandemic world, because the skills that they had that worked before are no longer working. What this means is that in order to undo clinging, we have to work on all 4 forms of clinging. See how your sense of who you are is embedded in a particular worldview, or a particular way that you see the world works. How it's related to the range of skills that you develop in your sense of what should and should not be done. And also the pleasures that are available to you in terms of the different things, like forms of sensuality. And sensuality here doesn't mean just blatant sensual pleasures, but also anything that comes in through the senses, in which you find pleasure in terms of having a status and having a particular power within society, or having a particular range of relationships in society. All of these things play a large role in defining your sense of who you are. So that's basically the Buddha's analysis of why we suffer, what suffering is, and why we suffer. And again, we suffer because we cling. The clinging, in fact, is the suffering. It's suffering because we're in a position where we have to feed all the time. Feeding is a precarious position to be in. And there are 4 types of clinging that we engage in. There's clinging to sensuality, our fascination with thinking about sensual pleasures, planning for sensual pleasures. In other words, our ideas of what we want. Then there are ideas of what is, in other words, how the world is and how the world works. There are ideas about what should be done within that world, what kind of actions are appropriate for finding pleasure that's worthwhile, what kinds of actions are not. And also your sense of who you are as an agent and as a consumer of the results of your actions. All of these things are interrelated, which means that in order to overcome our clinging to self, which is the basic clinging, we also have to deal with our attachment to sensuality. There are a lot of schools of thought that say, well, I'm going to just not worry about sensuality. I'm just going to go straight to the cause, and sensuality won't be a problem afterwards. But no, you have to work on the mind's fascination with planning sensual pleasure. It's fascination with trying to define the world in a way that enables it to act to find those pleasures, and then ideas of what should and shouldn't be done. So that's basically the main outline of the topic of what clinging is and why it is suffering. At this point, I would like to open the floor to questions.
So if you would please raise your blue digital hand, and then I will unmute you. And I see we have Kathy here. Ajaan Geoff, we have Kathy here.
Okay.
I'm just trying to find him.
You are
Yeah.
live, Kathy.
Yeah, okay. I wanted to see Ajaan Geoff, and I'm seeing you, so I was trying to change something here. So my question is, where do the hindrances fall within these four categories, or do they fall within all of them? Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Okay. Okay. Of course, sensual desire would come under sensual clinging. Ill will would also be written. They basically all come under. Well, the first two come under sensuality. Sensuality clinging. The sloth and torpor probably comes under sensuality as well. You know, you're just you think about how nice it would be to just lie down and go to sleep. Restlessness and anxiety may have to do more with your clinging to what should and shouldn't be done when you start thinking about what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And then uncertainty would be uncertainty, one, about who you are, what your identity is, and also uncertainty about the world outside, how it works. So that'd be one way in which you could relate the hindrances to the different forms of clinging.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Brock and June.
Hello, Ajaan.
Hi.
My question, I was thinking about the second noble truth around tanha, which I don't know, may be called craving, and what the relationship between tanha and upadana would be for craving or clinging.
Okay, well, the word tanha, craving, can also mean thirst. And so the relationship would basically be, given that upadana means to feed, and this is your thirst which drives you to need to feed.
Mm. So it's kind of a cause and effect.
Got muted somehow. Okay, it's the thirst is what's driving you to need to feed.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the sensuality craving, of course, would be related to sensuality, the fed of sensuality, or clinging, sensuality clinging. Becoming and non-becoming have to do with your sense of who you are in the world. So that would cover view clinging and doctrine of self-clinging.
Mm-hmm.
And then your sense of what you should and shouldn't do would probably be based then on, given who you are and what the world has to offer, what you should do within that world would derive from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff and Rita.
Good morning, Tanajan and group. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Tanajan, for being willing to do this. Craving seems to be very clear in that it takes an object. Becoming seems to be clear in that it takes that object, producer, consumer. What seems to be unclear is that clinging seems to be the gravitational force between these two. And it doesn't seem itself to necessarily take an object. It's rather not a noun, but a verb, even though we use it noun. And so does the Buddha sort of more clearly define what the whole gravitational force of of clinging is, and how that's actually the glue that makes all this happen?
Okay, well, it's he's got this image of how, as we're going from moment to moment, it's like a fire going from one house to the next, and it's your craving is what makes you go for the next house, and you hold on basically as that movement goes. So you're basically you're holding on to your craving, and the craving is going to be composed of these different aggregates.
So it's kind of nebulous, the holding on part.
Well, it's like holding on to a horse. You've got this horse running away and you're holding on and you're afraid it's going to buck you.
So the fact that there's a craving and a becoming create the holding on.
Okay, well,
Once there's no craving or a becoming.
the clinging is what leads to the becoming. You go from the craving through the clinging to becoming.
So you either stop your becoming or your craving and there's no clinging. Once one or the other end disappears, there can't be clinging.
You'd have to stop the craving.
So the
And
craving has.
That's why the Buddha says, to comprehend clinging means to put an end to any passion for it. When there's no passion for it, then that's the end of the craving.
So the craving is there before the clinging.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's creating that clinging and the becoming all
Yeah.
after.
Yeah.
And that craving comes as a result of the beginning of that ignorance of not seeing the process.
Craving is basically what gives you focus to your desire. I want X. And then around that, you have to develop an idea of who you are. Are you going to benefit from this, wanting that X? And if so, do you have it within your capability of doing it? Is it within this world? Is it possible to find that? And then what do you have to do in order to get it? All that's what the clinging is. And as you begin to hold on to that, then you create a state of becoming with an identity in a world. So this is what, starting with the raw craving, this is what gives shape to it in the idea of, given that this is what I want, how do I go about getting it? And is it is it worth it? And if it is, how do I do it?
Okay. So for us as beings, what's the shaking of the foot or going to the window? Is that the craving or is that the clinging? How are we the dog?
In that particular case, it's, you have certain Geoff ways of doing things. You've defined that these are the kinds of things I do, and there's certain things I do not do. And sometimes your Geoff things are things that actually get you up the stairs. And other Geoff things are, shaking your foot at the window.
So the shaking at the window is, that's a pattern that's not necessarily helpful or not.
It can actually get in the way, yeah.
Okay, so that's kind of just a waste of energy thing.
Mm-hmm.
But that habituated, got to do this before.
Right.
So we can actually get rid of that, still be in samsara, but not be directed towards, say, awakening.
Right.
We can cut out the foot shakes.
It's the purpose of, yeah. Sharon Salzberg tells a great story about one of her students who was in parking her car and she rammed into the car behind her. And she was so upset about, that she was going to have to call the police and all this other stuff, that she ran into a nearby store and bought something. And then she called the police.
Okay. The trip to the window.
The trip to the window.
Okay.
But that issue of, when you have a craving, and then the question is it something possible within the world? I mean, that's going to decide which cravings you act on and which ones you don't. And the fact that you don't act on a particular craving doesn't mean it's not there. It's just that you've calculated that it's not worth your effort even to think about it. An example I give you is when the economy started taking off in Thailand. We had a lot of farmers in the area around the monastery. And they seemed to be, a contented lot. They had a very simple life. And then Japanese businessmen came in. They wanted to buy up the land in that area. They were going to build a retirement home. And all of a sudden, these farmers suddenly found themselves with a huge stash of money. And from their point of view, and all of a sudden that opened up new possibilities for what they could do. Now, the number of them who actually used the money wisely was very small. They bought a pickup truck, they bought this, they bought that, but then they didn't have land anymore. So they had no source of income. But I mean, prior to that, they never even would have thought of a pickup truck.
Okay.
So there's a certain amount of calculation that goes on as to, okay, this is what I want, but given the way the world is, given the way the world acts, given who I am, is this even worth thinking about? So there'll be a lot of things that we just toss off because we say, okay, it's not practical right now, but the potential for that craving is still there.
Okay. So basically the Buddhist teachings are how to channel the cravings in such a way that you'll get your land back and have food for yourself. And then in the process, you'll be out of the whole.
Well, here's
ego
basically,
cycle.
a true happiness is possible. So a lot of people dismiss that as just an impossibility that wouldn't work that way in the world. And a large part of his message is that true unchanging happiness is possible. Focus your desire there.
Okay. Hence the need to have some faith. The
Have some faith.
working hypothesis that what he said is truly a possibility,
Right.
and
right.
work from there.
Which is why when we got into the path, we realized that there will be a certain view clinging and a certain habit and practice clinging and a certain doctrine of self clinging that you adopt as part of the path.
So we're basically taking the addiction of samsara and doing the steps that you said. We're replacing them with the path. We're changing the way we're perceiving the world, and then finding the process to
Right.
fulfill that end goal.
Right.
Great. Thank you very much.
Steve has a question from YouTube. Steve, I'll let you unmute yourself.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Aruna over here on the YouTube read your document, the clinging, that PDF that you sent, and there's a paragraph near the end that where you're talking about kind of coming out of clinging. At the same time, all you see is stress arising and stress passing away. And then a few lines later, the Buddha described this paradoxical moment with a simile. It's like crossing a river without moving or staying in place.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see. So her question is staying in place meaning inaction, and that there is actually watching of the origination and dissolution, and hence not inaction, which is staying in place?
Steve, can we have that question this afternoon? Can you save that for this afternoon?
Okay,
It'll make more sense after I've made my presentation this afternoon.
okay. We'll save that. There's another one here about, from Virginia. She mentioned, you mentioned the body as an aggregate, as owner of an aggregate, or as in the aggregate, and as the aggregate itself. You said this could be related to the body, but it could also be related to three other things. And she says, what are the three things?
Okay. Let me back up. There are four ways of identifying yourself around any one aggregate. The first way would be to say, I am that aggregate. In this case, if you take form as an aggregate, you say, I am form, I am my body. The second one would be, I am the owner of the aggregate. In other words, I have this self that is undefined at the moment, but it is the owner of the aggregate. The third one is, I am in the aggregate. In this case, I am in the body. And then the fourth one is, the aggregate is in me. I'm a bigger self than the body. Now that's dealing with that first aggregate. Now you can do that fourfold analysis with each of the five aggregates. So in other words, you can identify, I am my feelings, or I'm the owner of my feelings, or my feelings are in me, or I am in my feelings. The same with perceptions, the same with fabrication, the same with consciousness. So you've got four ways of relating to aggregates, five aggregates, 4 times 5, 20. There are 20 different ways you can identify yourself. Now, some people think that the Buddha here is talking about simply a limited sense of self, but no, that the idea that you could have the aggregate in you opens the possibility that you could identify yourself as an infinite self or as interconnected self, that would still count as a type of self-view. Hope that answers the question.
I'll thank you for Virginia.
Okay. And if Virginia doesn't like the answer, tell her to let me know.
So do we have any other questions at the moment? Warren, did you still want to ask your question?
I actually had one of my own, Linda.
Okay.
So.
Okay, and then go ahead, Steve, and then we'll have Ross and then Malia as well. So go ahead, Steve, and finish your question.
Okay. Well, this might be one that goes for the afternoon too, but in other writings, you've talked about kind of fabricating a self as a stepping stone on the path to get you to a later thing. And it seems like in your clinging document here, you're talking about, in some cases, fabricating a clinging to do the same thing, to step further along the path.
Because the point of the Buddha has about different ways of defining yourself is that some are more skillful than others. You know, if you define yourself simply as your body, you will tend to behave in certain unskillful ways, because everything you would do then would be for the purpose of continuing keeping the body going. Because if there's no body, then there's no you. So it would be hard to say, well, I'll be willing to sacrifice my life for the sake of the precepts or the sake of something higher than that. And so when we get to the path, which that is an afternoon question, you will be fabricating a type of sense of self. Although, as we'll be pointing out, it's pretty much a sketch. The Buddha doesn't go into a lot of detail about what you are or what you need to assume about yourself in order to practice. So all you need to assume about yourself is, 1, you're capable of doing this. 2, you're going to benefit from it. And then 3, your sense of who you are is something that you create. He says you create it by the way you latch onto any of the aggregates. And that's what becomes being. And this being keeps going, keeps feeding, and it can be sustained by clinging and craving, which means it doesn't need a body in order to survive. Your sense of you as a being will, at the end of when the life of the body ends, there's something in there that will want to keep on going. It will keep trying to find something new. And so you're going to be creating this. You're going to also, as in order to function in the path, you also need a sense of self. You will have to hold on to certain things as well. So but these are the things that you have to hold on for the sake of the path.
Ross?
I would like to hear more about the correspondence between Freud and the 4 forms of clinging.
Okay. Okay, first with Freud, you've got his analysis of the id, the ego, and the superego. Superego is your idea of what you should be doing, what society has been telling you about what's proper and what's improper. The id is basically your raw desires, which for Freud are primarily sexual, but they can sensual desires of any kind. And then in between the two, you've got your ego, which has to function, which has to negotiate among these. Because if the ego is weak, either the superego takes over, in which you're mild and meek and obedient and everything, but you're basically an oppressed person in the society. Either that or the id takes over, in which you're totally uncontrolled.
Right.
Now, all of these functions of the personality then operate within what he called the reality principle. It's not that you can, that your ideas of what you should do will automatically make things become a reality, and it's not automatic that your desires will become a reality. You have to take the ego also has to take into consideration what is actually possible. So that gives you the 4 different kinds of clinging right there. With the superego being clinging to habits and practices, In other words, your idea, your beliefs about what should and should not be done. The ego being your sense of self. Sensuality clinging being the id. And then view clinging with being the reality principle within which all of this has to operate. Now for Freud, the conflict between the id and the superego was never going to be resolved. There's always going to be a tension there. The idea of what you should do and what the shoulds have nothing to do with your happiness. I mean, Freud grew up in a very strict Judeo-Christian background, in which it's particularly in the Jewish side, where God basically has these rules that have nothing to do with your happiness at all. You just have to obey.
Thank you.
Now, for the Buddha, there's this conflict is not irresolvable, because when he gives you the Four Noble Truths, there's a sense of duties that go with the Four Noble Truths, but those duties are for the sake of your happiness. You're supposed to comprehend suffering, abandon the cause, so you can realize the cessation of suffering, and you do that by developing the path. So those are the duties within the Buddhist teachings. And these are not irreconcilable with your desire for happiness. In fact, they're there for the sake of your happiness. The big conflict is going to be, as we'll see, that sensuality clinging has no role in the path. When you're sitting there meditating and you're fantasizing about ice cream at the end of the day, that's not part of the path. Maybe part of your meditation, but it's not part of the path. But and so the Buddha's going to say you're going to have to substitute another form of pleasure for that in order to keep going on the path. That's what the practice of concentration is all about. But as I said earlier, though, the big difference between Freud and the Buddha is that the Buddha takes these four different kinds of clinging. He says the tension among them can be reconciled if you take on the right sense of what you should and shouldn't do. And you're willing to order your other desires in line with that.
Thank you.
So we'll have Malia from Russia, and then Steve will have another YouTube question. Malia?
Venerable Ajaan, may I take this opportunity to thank you for your teaching today and earlier. Please accept my sincere appreciation for your help. For many years, I have been a listener of your Dharma talks, and the encounter with them for me meant even not matter of life and death, but much deeper. So please accept my sincere appreciation and for your kindness, for your contribution to humankind. So, and I'm Buddhist, and for me, it's very important to find truth. And so I'm sorry if I will stumble upon asking your question, because it's for me it's so exciting this moment. So, and I actually some philosophical questions of the Buddha time are no longer controversial in our days, because it is scientifically proved that our universe is 13.7 billion years old. So it's not eternal. And so rotation between human worlds and heavenly worlds and hell worlds, it looks unrealistic to me, because as a civilized society, mankind exists maybe with advance of agriculture 10,000 years BC. So, and that lifespan in this world is too long compared to our existence. So compared to the universe, we exist like in a blink of eye. So it's not, it can be even compared. So I really, I really worried about the most beings are destined to be dead, because then stars will go out of fuel, and in our universe will no planet suitable for habitation. So, and maybe even deep structure of matter will collapse at certain point when universe will cool down. So, and where and how living being will exist. So for me, it's a big question. Because I would like to find a way to explain it for myself according to the Buddha teaching. So it's even I try to apply different approaches to this problem, like this on the surface it's kind of illusion, but we are designed to perceive this illusion and it's behind this illusion there is definitely there is reality where we are caught. So for me it's a big question. So, and thank you, Ajaan. I'm sorry for a little bit of mess in my, because I'm so nervous. I'm really grateful to you. I'm very happy. You even can't imagine how I enjoy seeing you and have opportunity to ask you a question. And thank you, our group and the organizer. I'm very happy because for me it's a big deal to join your group. Thank pandemic. Thank you.
Okay, well, the Buddha says, there are many levels of being, and the universe that the science knows is just one level of many levels of being that exist right now. And there are passages where they talk about how, when this level of being burns up, beings that have been living here will go to other levels. There are higher levels and there are lower levels that we can go to. The middle level gets burned up and then it reforms again. And as it reforms, we can come back in. So when science is talking about the universe, they're talking about, the human level of the universe. But part of right view is accepting the idea that there are many other levels as well, where beings can latch on to it and take birth in the meantime. In other words, this is not the only universe.
Maybe it is like our universe is a part of eternal existing multi-universe.
It's kind of a multi-universe, and some parts of it stay relatively constant, and the level we're on undergoes constant. It's not the Big Bang theory; it's the bang, and then disappearing, then bang again, disappearing, bang again, disappearing.
But it makes sense to me, but it's difficult to understand. But because our world depends on physical existence, on physical some law which we cannot control.
Right.
So and.
However, the mind itself can, consciousness can survive without having to depend on the body. What it says, as long as there's craving, consciousness can cling to the craving. And the craving, of course, depends on the consciousness. And the two of them can keep each other going indefinitely. And if there's no place within this particular world, they will find other worlds to go.
And one more question. Does the Arahant has a body?
While the Arahant is living as a human being, yes. But after total nirvana, then there's no body.
Because I at once I also saw a passage where we were told about the Arahant body. So I was a little bit.
Okay, the word body in Pali can also mean group. A group of Arahants.
Thank you, John. Hope to see you again.
Okay, fine.
Steve, I think you had a couple questions from YouTube.
Yes, Barbara asks, she says, this feels like an intellectual talk about something that is experiential. I try to comprehend with images of what Ajaan Geoff is saying and using those images instead of concepts when I get self-centered. That feels helpful to me, i.e. stops me from thinking too much.
Mhm.
Can you say any more about that?
Okay, well, you're going to need both sort of the intellectual background and a way of visualizing it to yourself. I mean, if you can't visualize it to yourself, then it's just, as you said, it's just words. But if you think about this, you know, you can think about take a particular instance. You know, you have a desire for what? Let's go with ice cream. You have a desire for ice cream. And okay, you live in a world where ice cream is available. And ice cream can be attained through certain means. Either you make it yourself or you have to go out and buy it. And you ask yourself, do I have the means by which I can make it? And if I do, and then I'll just go ahead and make it. If I don't, maybe I have the means by which I could go out and buy it. So the fantasizing about the ice cream, that would be clinging to sensuality. Thinking about the world in which ice cream is available, that would be clinging to a particular view. And then your sense of view of having the capabilities of either making the ice cream or buying the ice cream, that would be a doctrine of self. And then there's the question, well, should I go out for the ice cream? You know, is it good for me to be doing something like this? Well, that sugar is going to be better. It's probably be better. On the other hand, if I don't have any sensual pleasures at all, my things are going to get pretty dry. So it's just a sensual pleasure that's worth going for or not. That would all have to do with clinging to habits and practices. So if you can learn how to visualize this in particular, in your concrete instances, then you begin to see, you know, where you're clinging in a particular situation, which is the suffering. But it's good to have the intellectual framework back there to give you kind of a checklist as to where the possible areas of clinging and suffering might be. Because I know a lot of people say, I have a really bad, you know, I really hate myself. I want to get rid of myself. I said, well, wait a minute, there's part of yourself is useful. And you've got to learn how to figure out which part of yourself is going to be actually useful on the path. Don't get rid of yourself entirely right away. So it's good to be able to analyze this so you can figure out exactly, you know, where am I holding on in an unskillful way? What can I change? So this is something that's going to require both an intellectual background and a way of visualizing it to yourself to make sense of where you are in a particular situation.
Thank you. Joseph says, thank you, Ajaan Geoff. The clinging is the suffering. How does my subjective experience of strong states of suffering like fear, anxiety, or sadness relate to or arise from clinging?
Oh, the fear, of course, comes from the things that you're clinging to or feel threatened. Sadness is something that you were clinging to that you really were happy with. You thought you found something that was really reliable, and then you began to see it's being taken away. And as I said, this all tends to relate to our sense of self. You know, our sense of who we are also depends on how we see the world in which we live. And if we see that, you know, I see a lot of, you know, very unscrupulous people getting ahead in the world. It challenges our idea that your goodness is worthwhile, and that can give rise to a sense of sadness. But then you have to realize, okay, we're talking about, the Buddha was talking about, you know, the rewards of good action sometimes take a long time. And so if you can learn how to talk to yourself in a way that gets past the sadness. In other words, once you recognize what it is that you've been holding on to that makes you sad or makes you fear, then you can do something about it. If it's a case of your source of food and in the way you identify yourself or the way you identify the world being threatened, maybe you have to say, okay, maybe I have to change the way I identify myself. Maybe I have to change my view of the world so it's not so easily threatened.
Warren?
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
You can hear, but I can't hear you.
Is there a risk of over-intellectualizing certain spiritual teachings? That is, can becoming more knowledgeable about certain things actually become a hindrance in any way?
It depends on how you use the knowledge. I mean, there's some knowledge which is not all that practical. It's I mean, we get a lot of this, say, in the Abhidhamma in Buddhism. A lot of the analyses just go, far beyond the realm of what's actually applicable. Which is one of the reasons when I always like to keep referring things back to the Buddhist teachings to his son, which are basically, the teaching is all about looking at your actions, looking at your motivation, looking at what you're doing based on the motivation, and looking at the results. And if you see any harm or disturbance or anything that you're creating in any of those three areas, then there's something got to change. And so when you encounter a teaching that seems intellectual, you can ask yourself, does this actually apply in this context? Does this help me understand my motivation? Does it help me get more clear about what I'm? Does it help me focus on seeing things that are unskillful in the way I'm missed otherwise? In this particular case, the analysis of the different kinds of clinging should help you figure out when I'm acting in certain ways, but I'm acting for the sake of happiness, but I'm coming up with suffering. What am I doing wrong? What am I clinging to in an unskillful way? That's how you would apply this.
Thank you.
But if it's a discussion basically for the sake of let's argue about what the Buddha taught on some topic, okay, that's misuse of the. I mean, in my own case, when I was studying with Ajaan Geoff, we didn't have any suttas. We didn't have much in terms of readings. It was just doing the practice. And in some ways that was good, but in other ways it was, I found it useful once I encountered the suttas that it helped me to articulate to myself what was going on in my practice. And once I was able to articulate it, then I was able to, see aspects of it, the practice that I had missed before. Which I think, the stopping every now and then to articulate what you're doing is a useful exercise.
Jeff and Rita?
Tanha and Jhana, I was wondering if you could explain why it's so easy for us to see, say, other people's habit patterns, why it's so difficult for them to give up these things, but it's in ourselves.
You're talking about Rita there? You're talking about the woman in the back there?
Well, just in general, why is clinging so personal and kama so personal? And it's not, say, that we're all mixed and matched in this. We've done this so often, and yet it still remains so personal.
Well, as I said, all these different kinds of clinging basically come down to the fact that you're clinging to your sense of who you are. And that's something that's very intimate and very hard to see. It's like looking at your nose. Your eyes are designed so that you don't see your nose, right? You have to look into a mirror in order to see the nose, and then you see a backwards reflection. And this is one of the reasons why the Buddha says you've got to learn how to get past these forms of clinging. You really do have to start looking at how you create your sense of who you are. Start taking it apart, seeing it as an activity rather than as a given.
So the mirror is the path in the sense of self-reflection.
Right. And it also has to, just the teachings themselves teach you to reflect on what you're doing. And the teacher should point to you and say, this is something you're doing, this is something you're doing wrong.
Holding up that mirror.
Holding up the mirror to you, yeah.
So you've written about deperceiving
Mhm.
and maybe depersonalizing as we're personalizing.
Mhm.
Where's the balance between these steps you've talked about? We've got to cling to the raft before we let go.
Mhm.
And you certainly can share about trying to let go of the raft too soon
Mhm.
before it's fully developed. So at what point is there the balance where the mind is that it's letting go of its own perception? It's kind of splitting off, and it's gaining momentum in the ability to let go of, say, the fear of not having that self anymore, or it
Like
knows
it's,
this.
part of it has to do with the fact that you're going to be replacing one clinging with a more subtle one. If you try to get rid of your clingings without having anything to hold on to at all, it's going to be disorienting. It's when you've got something better to hold on to, and then you realize, okay, I finally have found something better, and my attachment to some of my old attachments is getting in the way of the better thing that I've found. That's when you know you can let go of the old ones.
The mind becomes more secure in the subtlety practice, say the
Right.
jhana.
Right, right.
It actually is, that's where the samvega begins to just accumulate and say, I've got something better.
Right.
Is there a point where there is a natural momentum, and there is not before stream entry, where the mind can encourage itself? I think this is it. Like there's momentum gaining, or is it just a crapshoot until you hit that?
It's trial and error. It's not a crapshoot.
There are a lot of trials and a lot of errors out
Yeah,
there.
yeah. But then, I mean, finally, there's trial and success. Okay,
Okay.
and it's learning how to recognize. Okay, I let go too early, and I've got to go back and pick something up that I let go of too early.
Okay. Just staying with the path.
Yeah.
Into the path.
Again, it's that those instructions are, look at what you're doing. Look at the results. You say, well, something inside me said I should let go of X, but when I let go of X, these things are not good anymore. I better go back and pick it up again.
Right. Okay. I think you shared many times about the subtlety when it's two close choices, two good close choices, and you just said, pick one, see how it works, see what your results are, and then go from there.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Speaking of trial and success, for those in the West who know what DW40 is, it's DW40 because there were 39 failures before they got to 40. And I think Steve has another question from the internet.
I didn't hear, was that for me?
Yes.
Yes, Steve.
Okay, good. Yeah, we have a couple here kind of on a similar topic. Tiara asks, establishing jhanas taught in the commentary seems to involve clinging to the object of meditation, whereas the way it is taught in the suttas involves tranquilizing or letting go, which I take to mean releasing clinging. Have I understood correctly? Are these methods quite different in their approach with regard to clinging?
There's going to be, whenever you're concentrating the mind, you're going to have to be holding on to an object and letting go of everything else. Now, with the jhanas as they're described in the suttas, you do have to have the word jayati basically means that you're burning with a steady flame. So there's one thing where you stay steady, and you're going to have to hold on to that. Now, whether you call the holding on clinging or not clinging, that's going to depend on your skill as a meditator. But in the beginning, you're going to cling. There's no two ways about it. And then it's letting go of everything else. And that's for the jhanas in the commentaries. Again, there's a very strong sense you've got to hold on to that one object regardless of it. But you do have to let go of everything else that would distract you from the object. So the differences between the two approaches is for the commentaries, jhana is a very one-pointed state of mind, whereas for the canon, it's a large, full body awareness. And so that full body awareness, you've got to hold on to that if you're going to be concentrated at all. And then the things that come through the range of that awareness, those are the things you let go of. And then as the mind settles down, it's like peeling an onion. Or there's this extra layer that's no longer necessary, so you peel that away, and then you peel another layer away. But still, there's a sense of having to stay grounded in that one object.
And then Ken asks a kind of similar question. In a state of concentration, once directed thought has been dropped, what might be some of the other forms of clinging that might need to be dropped in order to go to the next level?
Okay, well, the first one is you're going to have a sense of rapture there that you know you've learned to associate with the state of concentration, and you're afraid to let that go. That's one of the things you're going to have to let go of. Is okay, if I want to get my mind to get to a more stable level, I'm going to have to let go of this upwelling sense of rapture, whether it's a fullness or a sense of energy flowing through the body. I've got to tune into a level of energy that's much more subtle. So that would be one of the things you let go of. There's also the felt sense after a while, there's the body's breath energies are all connected and they're all full. And yet there's still a sense, well, I got to keep pumping the breath in, because otherwise if I don't keep pumping the breath in, I'm going to die. But when the breath energy is full, everything is all connected. And I can't explain this in terms of Western physiology, but there comes a point where you really don't need to breathe. And if you learn how to let go of your fear of not breathing, then you can go into that level of concentration. Is that it from YouTube?
Yeah, that's all I have for now.
Okay.
And anybody else from Zoom?
June, no questions?
Zoom? No questions at the moment from Zoom.
Now something.
Just appreciating everything, Ajahn.
Good.
Barb M. Barb?
I have one. There's probably no easy answer to this, but Tanha, if you know, like there's the ice cream, and then you know there's something better like jhana, but then you still kind of want both. But you know you have to give up the ice cream to have the jhana. But in the moment, the ice cream's easier. So
Okay.
how to motivate yourself?
Okay. Well, this is okay. You know, think about which form of clinging is going to help you out of this.
Yeah, but to me it seems like, okay, the whole clinging to things that don't last. The ice cream doesn't last.
Mm-hmm.
Jhana doesn't last. It's to get your sensitivity so you notice things more, but that's not going to last either.
Well, no, I was but in terms of clinging to habits and practices, you might say, hey, this is jhana is a habit I've really got to develop. It's a practice I've really got to learn how to master. Mm-hmm. I've mastered ice cream a long time ago.
Yeah, so maybe that would be work that you haven't mastered jhana yet. So that's the good one to go for as a challenge, right, rather than the ice cream is too easy.
Right. And even though the jhana doesn't last, it's going to, once you've mastered it, it's going to be able to make things available to you that the ice cream would never make available to you.
Yeah, that's true. Well, everything that's going on, you think the human world kind of really doesn't make a lot of possibilities available to you that are so great. So maybe something better would be good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen with the pandemic is how many things can be taken away from us so very quickly.
Yeah, like things we think we need or we have to have to live, like even electricity, you know, things you think you have to live, but people live for tons of years with no electricity, no internet. But yet we feel like we need all these things more and more.
And so then it throws you back and say, well, what are the things I have that I can depend on myself for, regardless of what society makes available? As long as your sense of who you are is so easily defined by the things that society's made available for you. You know, I'm the kind of person who can negotiate my way around the way things were, you know, prior to 2020. But that part of you now has been called into question because there's so many things that have been blocked off. But your practice of virtue, your practice of concentration, your practice of discernment, that doesn't have to depend on society. So this is a good time to start cultivating. This would be a good way to redefine my idea about where I should look for pleasure, redefine my idea of who I am, where my skills are. Because, you know, a large part of how you defined yourself before is no longer available, it's no longer possible. And the only way to expand your sense of self is to expand your range of skills. And so your skill in getting the mind to settle down, maybe that's something you should work on.
Well, I know it is. You just get busy with all this other stuff and you feel like you're pulled in all these directions and this is what you should do or what you need to do. And we're not really emphasized how to have skills, how to produce things on our own, just how to do some work and buy stuff.
Yeah.
Rather than you can learn these skills and do these things instead of getting some ice cream or whatever, you know?
Yeah.
So it is possible.
It is possible, which is why it's good to realize, okay, your sense of who you are is something you've created. It's an activity. And we'll be going to more of this in the afternoon. And so you can actually recreate your sense of self by changing your range of skills.
It seems like you need like an Etch-a-Sketch to wipe all that out and then start with some new skills.
I'm doing here is saying, I'll never be able to get to the end of the path. And I said, well, the person you are will not get to the end of the path, but the person you will become as you follow the path will eventually be able to get you to the end.
Well, that's it. What if there's some bit of you that doesn't want to let go of the person, even though you know it's stupid and won't get you to the end of the path?
Okay,
There's still some clinging there.
Keep working on the other person that wants to do the path. Whenever your lazy self is getting late, you know, is not too strong at the moment. Okay, that's your chance to work harder on the path.
Yeah.
And then the you that identifies with being on the path, that's going to get stronger and stronger. You can't wait until your lazy self goes away and then do the path. You're going to have to do the path while your lazy self is still there.
I know, because it doesn't go away. It just gets lazier, right?
Yeah. So you're going to fight a while.
What was that?
You're going to be fighting it off for quite a while.
Yeah. Okay.
Like, you know, the most diligent meditator I know of is Ajaan Geoff. And he always complains about how basically lazy he was.
But he doesn't seem at all reading this writings about him.
I know, but again, there was something inside him he had to fight.
Is that why he always talks? Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We have Willow, and then Steve has a question from YouTube, and then we have Valentin from Seattle. So Willow?
Okay.
Thank you for taking my question, Jeff. A bird in your room there, or is that coming from somewhere else?
What?
Is there a bird where you are?
Yeah, lots of crows. Lots of crows. Yes.
I just wondered if it was the internet or an actual bird.
Real thing.
Okay, nice. So my question is, where does clinging to the life force itself come in? And I'll just leave it there.
Okay, the life force itself is energized by craving. It's the craving that comes forth, and that's what gives the life force that keeps you going. Without the craving, the life force wouldn't be there.
So there's a desire to, there's an energy of nature that's there. There's a life force in that is tangible. And there's a desire to be part of that and to open to that energy of life, to be in that flow without so much separation. So I just don't know what it means.
Okay, well, in that particular case, you've got the view of the life force as something out there that you want to join. So you're clinging to that view of the life force.
Okay.
And then the craving that says, okay, given that this is the way the world is, that's where I'm going to go. And this is what I've got to do. So you've got different kinds of clinging already developing around that.
Okay. Is that a skillful clinging?
Well, as long as you use your life force skillfully, yes. If it's just for the sake of surviving, it can go either way.
Okay, yeah. And what about, you were talking about the desire to breathe and giving, it seems to me that would be associated with a fear of death.
Right.
And so you could go either way, like you're saying, and that's maybe where sati comes in. And
mindfulness and alertness, yeah, to remind you, hey, this could be unskillful. Watch out.
Okay, so it's not necessarily unskillful to want to breathe.
No. But when you've got to the point where the mind is settled down where it doesn't have to, if you're going to create a stage of concentration, say, okay, I could stop. And then
I lost
the mind
you. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. It's basically, if you've got the breath energy in the body to the point where the breath energy is full, the mind is really, really still. And the only disturbance you've got at that point is the fact that you're breathing. And you can remind yourself, okay, this is optional. I don't have to force the breath in and out. Just let me stay there with that sense of the breath energy being connected.
Okay. So the hindrance there would be a thought about a fear of letting go of breathing.
Right, fear of dying.
If you're ready and your body's ready and your level of meditation is ready, then it's a skillful thing to do. Okay, thank you.
Steve from YouTube, and then Valentine, and then Maren from Norway.
And then I think we'll have to end.
Yeah. Okay, Tiara asks, how is the concept of voidness or emptiness related to clinging? Is it merely a perception where we are not clinging to these aggregates?
Okay, emptiness would be a whole day topic right there. There are different kinds of emptiness. The idea of something being empty of self, if you cling to the idea that there is no self, okay, that would be a doctrine of self-clinging. If you simply see that something that you used to identify with, and you realize that really doesn't belong to me. I thought it did, but it really doesn't belong to me. That's actually a perception or a view that's useful in the path. So the view of emptiness can be used in different ways and can function in different ways, either as a cause of suffering or as a part of the path to the end of suffering, depending on how you use it.
Okay, we'll have Valentin from Seattle, and then Maren from Norway, and then Steve, will you go over how we'll proceed for the afternoon? So Valentin?
Ajaan, I have a question. This is related to Barb's question. So what would be a good strategy to make jhana more attractive, more interesting? So concentration feels good, but I still have to make effort to go to meditation. So it's not that I'm attracted to it, let's say, obsessed with jhana. How would be a good. Thank you.
Okay, part of it is talking to yourself about the advantages that will come if you get really good at this. In other words, you see the potential that it has. And the other things you could be doing with your time right now don't have that potential. It's like that Far Side cartoon with the two penguins. They're on an ice floe. One of them is playing the piano, another has a little hat and a cane. And the one with the hat and the cane says, no, again from the top, this is our only ticket out of here. In other words, you look around at the world and it's looking pretty dismal right now. And so remember, jhana is your only way out. So you got to learn how to talk to yourself, saying, okay, it may not be showing all of its benefits right now, but it's got great potential. And then secondly, if you can find a way of breathing in a way that does give rise to a sense of fullness and real well-being in the body, then you can remember that, take note of that. It's okay, this is something that I can aim for. So you use the carrot and the stick, but then see whichever one works.
Thank you.
Maren?
Hi, Ajaan. I wonder if I have understood this correctly. The four forms of clinging, is that like general categories, and then the five aggregates would have to be present in every one of these in different ways?
Yeah, you've got the types of clinging. Those are the general categories, and then some of them might get focused on a feeling, or they might get focused on a thought construct. It's not the case that you will have all five aggregates in any one instance of clinging. But when you find yourself holding on to something, you ask yourself, okay, in what way am I holding on to this? One, what am I holding on to? Two, what is the way I'm holding on to it? So you have some forms of clinging, like you might be clinging to a particular perception or a particular feeling without much concern about your body at that particular point, or a thought construct. It's just the perception is something that's really attractive, or the feeling is really attractive.
So,
however, right.
In the example with the ice cream from before, that would be focusing on the form and maybe focus just on that, and then the other aggregates put aside? Or could it be a feeling or perception being present in that example at the same time?
You've got quite a lot there, because you've got the feeling. It tastes really good. You've got the perception. The ice cream is really cool. I really like ice cream a lot. And then you've got the thought fabrication that has all the elaboration about ice cream is really great. So you've got several aggregates functioning all at the same time. The problem with the word aggregate is it makes it sound like they're nouns. Actually, they're verbs.
Okay.
The things you're doing.
Yeah. I'm trying to wrap my head around those aggregates. I find it a bit difficult. That was a helpful example. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ajaan. It's very, very interesting morning.